Buckle up for a new episode of Bumpaholics, the one and only podcast made to teach on all stages of the arrival of a baby, before, during, and after. Whether you're an expecting mother, have questions about fertility, difficulty with lactation, or postpartum, you're sure to learn from our experienced doulas when you listen to Bumpaholics.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Casey Women's Ministry. We are so excited to have you, and I am so honored to be joined today by Tina Mody of the Maya's Wings Foundation.
Thank you, Kristen. Hi, everyone. I'm Tina Mody, like Kristen said, and I am the co-founder of the Maya's Wings Foundation. I'm really excited to be here today.
Thank you so much. We are going to jump right in because we have some really deep questions to talk about today. The Maya's Wings Foundation is an amazing organization that is really helping to bring up the topic of infertility and loss and support for people who a lot of times don't have a voice. And I'm so excited to get to talk to you about some of these questions and to bring it to our listeners. So can you share your story with us and kind of talk about what led you to found the Maya's Wings Foundation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think where I would start is I myself have infertility, and I have gone through the assisted reproductive technology ART process, including intrauterine insemination failure and in vitro fertilization, and have success with that. And what I will say is, with my first pregnancy, my son, it was a blissful process. Of course, completely naive going into it. Even as a clinical pharmacist, having the knowledge with healthcare utilization, the medication, I still feel like I'm just going to go and do exactly what the specialists are asking me to do. I'm not going to ask too many questions. I understand the medication aspect of it, but in terms of the protocol, why I'm doing certain things, I have no idea, but it helped me. I have my son. I was pregnant. It was a great pregnancy. There are some concerns at moments where I would need extra ultrasound, and because of growth that we were concerned with, and that unfortunately is pretty common in IVF. And I'll talk more about that later. But I will say what drove us to start the Maya's Wings Foundation was after having our baby boy, and he was 2.5, 2 at the time when we tried to expand our family, went through the embryo transfer process again with our daughter Maya. She was great. She was measuring completely normal, even from the get-go, well above what we saw with her brother from our first IVF baby. And nothing really caused us to be concerned with that process, since we've already gone through that process. I didn't think to ask too many questions, it should be expected. And then I developed a subchorionic hematoma around, I would say probably 8 or 9 weeks, and noticed bleeding from then on. And at that time, I was told that actually subchorionic hematoma is very common in IVF, and I didn't know that until I developed it and started bleeding. And so they monitored me as normal. They didn't think anything of it. She was growing perfectly well, developing normal within all of the measurements that we do on a very regular basis. And it was not until, and I would say they took me off of an aspirin regimen, which is totally something you would be on when you're going through some of the IVF process, just to make sure that if you are doing a lot of hormones, so you don't get any type of clotting effects in that aspect. Mm-hmm. And also it helps with the blood flow from the placenta to the baby, which is something that is critical too. So they took me off of aspirin because I was no longer doing injections for the hormones, and the bleeding stopped, which is great. That took a whole lot of anxiety away, because I definitely didn't experience that with my son during the first IVF process. And then it was not until 16 weeks when I was going for my 16-week appointment. Literally, I drove up to the hospital that day, parked the car, got out, and I just felt it felt like my water broke. And I rushed in, and of course, the nurses rushed me quickly into the clinic to do an ultrasound. And at that point, they saw Maya. She was thriving. Her heart rate was great. She had fluid around her. And I was told at that time, this could be nothing, and that she's looking great. We'll have you come back the next day to do a more thorough scan, just to make sure that maybe it's the placenta inserting too low. And I didn't think at that point to have to question that, because of course, I'm not the expert in the room. I depend on the experts for those information. So we went home that day, and shortly after being home, I started experiencing a lot of cramps, and, sorry for the visual or the too much information, just a lot of clotting and blood and all of that led me to go to the ED that night. And this is all during COVID shutdown, March 11th of 2021. And we have to wake our son up, who's 2.5 at the time, to go with us to the ED. And my wife, Bella, and my son was not able to join me in the ED because they can't allow children in the hospital. So I was wheeled in and was essentially miscarrying my daughter, Maya, in the ED. Mm-hmm. And we lost her at that time. Devastated, of course, and was blindsided, to be quite honest, because we have gone through the IVF process, have thought we realized the risks that we're taking, at least the risk that was presented to us at that point. And then it was not until after the fact that, and I will say too about the miscarriage that happened that day. And then I think, to be more sensitive for me, it's more of a pregnancy loss. I don't think I miscarried that pregnancy. I think to me, it's a loss. And all that to say is it happened so quickly. I had a retained placenta that they had to rush me urgently to do a D&C. And at that point, reflecting back on that and the most recent Supreme Court ruling around Roe versus Wade makes me so grateful to be in the state that reproductive rights are not restricted, because had I not been rushed in to do a D&C at that time, I may not be here talking to you. So I just want to highlight that and be grateful for that. And I think going back, I know it's been a long story, but going back to, why we started Maya's Wings Foundation, shortly after losing Maya that night, we met with a maternal fetal medicine provider, try to get some more answers. Why did this happen? Why did I have a placental abruption that night? Is it because of the subchorionic hematoma that I experienced early on? And what were the signs that I should be looking out for? Did I do something? I think that's a common question that a lot of pregnant people who have gone through pregnancy loss, there's a lot of self-blame, and I think that's something that we definitely need to address, because it's definitely not your fault, first and foremost. And some things you don't have control over. And I think the worst scenario that you could be in is not having the answer to even why. And I think that's what drove us to start the Maya's Wings Foundation, is to help us help others and empower others to ask the questions, and also to advance research in that space, because IVF is less than 50 years old. There's so much that we've done in advancing pregnancy rates and increasing the effectiveness of conceiving, but birth outcomes, we're still very much lacking a lot of knowledge in that space on what optimizes birth outcomes for IVF pregnancies. And that's really for the Maya's Wings Foundation that stemmed our why. We want to advance that aspect and empower other patients who are going through this process to ask questions and not feel like they're blindsided. And that's essentially why we started the Maya's Wings Foundation, why we have the IVF resources, to have all these resources for the patients that are going through this very taxing process and be able to feel empowered to ask more questions if needed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so, thank you for sharing your story. And we love when people are willing to share their authentic story with detail, because preparing people for what may or may not happen is important, and helping people to feel empathized, seen, and heard from hearing their stories represented by other people is so relieving to them. And that's one of our huge goals, and one of the things that I really feel a kindred spirit with you in sharing your story. So thank you so much for doing that. What are some complications that are associated with IVF pregnancy?
I am so glad you asked that question, because that is something that not until we've lost Maya and have started the Maya's Wings Foundation have we uncovered that IVF does carry a good amount of risk to not only the person who's going through the IVF process, but also to the baby and to the embryo, to the fetus, etc. And I will say that the most common complications that you would hear when going into the IVF process is having multiple children. Those are common complications that they would put as risk factors, because we know that carrying twins, triplets, and so on definitely increases a whole bunch of separate complications, from small for gestational age to the possibility of losing one of the baby during the in utero process. So those are complications that they do talk about as you're going through the IVF process. Another one is specifically for the egg retrieval process. The ovarian hyperstimulation is something that's often talked about, OHSS, really depending on the protocols that you're being put on, your age, etc., and what your body and how it reacts to after the retrieval process. And we've actually have friends who have developed severe OHSS where they are hospitalized, needing fluid, and that could be very scary. And that is a risk that is very much known and highlighted during IVF, which I'm grateful for that they do talk about. I think what I will say before talking about the other complications is knowing additional complications associated with IVF would not have deterred me from going through the IVF process, simply because without IVF, I wouldn't have my 4-year-old son now. I wouldn't have Maya, my angel baby, and I wouldn't be pregnant with our 3rd child right now. So I am thankful that IVF exists, especially for people who have a diagnosis of infertility or wouldn't have the ability to have their own children without IVF. And I will also say something that I've mentioned earlier, that IVF is still relatively a very new technology in this world that, again, we spent majority of the first couple of decades trying to optimize how to increase pregnancy rate, which is very important, right? If you can't even get someone pregnant, you're not going to have the live birth outcome. I think what we need to shift focus on is how do we optimize and have better birth outcomes that can help reduce complications and make IVF more than just increasing pregnancy rates, but increasing live birth rates is something that, we're going to work towards. And it's going to be something that we're going to continue to work towards with not only the Maya's Wings Foundation, but with other partners that are working exactly in this space, like ASRM and many other reproductive fertility clinics. So I do appreciate those partnerships. The less known complications, going back to complications, is oftentimes when you think about IVF, aside from the multiple children that could happen and the OHSS that I've mentioned, some things that we now, the Maya's Wing, know after losing Maya is that there's a lot of complications associated with the placenta. I've heard multiple times from clinicians where they hear, from the OBs or maternal fetal medicine providers, if they hear that a patient has gone through the IVF process, the first thing they're going to think about is the placenta. Will there be any placenta complications like placenta previa, developmentous cord, or placental abruptions? And those are all actually more commonly seen in IVF pregnancies than non-IVF pregnancies at a much higher rate. We don't know why. And that's precisely what the research that we're hoping to support this year in collaboration with ASRM to help fund, because that is something that not only if we can find out that information from an IVF standpoint, we also know that it's not just unique to IVF, right? We know that this can happen in non-IVF pregnancies and what we would call spontaneous pregnancies, that you can still see these complications, but we don't know why. So we're hoping that whatever information that we can glean from these research can not only be translated into IVF, but also in non-IVF pregnancies, which is critical to optimizing live birth rates for all. I think what I will want to really highlight for the Maya's Wings Foundation, although our focus is really IVF, but outcomes that we want to optimize, it's not just for IVF pregnancy, it's for everyone. And then other things that I might have talked about a little bit in terms of complications is fetal growth restriction. Something that I myself have experienced through my own IVF journey is with my first pregnancy that I had mentioned, I had a lot of monitoring because I had a developmentous cord. And what was really interesting to me was when I met with my OB at the time, it's like, that's pretty normal, or we see that pretty commonly in IVF. And in my mind, it's like, how come this wasn't talked about? During the time when I'm going through the IVF consultation, none of these were surfaced. Why is it that I'm finding out after the fact? And I think that's precisely what IVF Resources is about. We want to bring forward information to educate and empower folks as they're going through this process to know that these complications exist, not to be afraid of them. It can be very frightening, but to more so ask more questions if needed so that you can feel secure when making the decision. You feel like you're making an informed decision. And again, I wouldn't change my decision regardless, knowing these information. It's more for empowering me to ask maybe some additional questions. But again, without IVF, I wouldn't have the children that I have. So those are some of the complications that we talk about in IVF Resources. And definitely, we have literature that demonstrate the significance that we're seeing from IVF and non-IVF pregnancies, and where there might be some overlap, and how might impacting and optimizing protocols associated with IVF can translate into how we want to standardize the process for even just OB care, doula care, et cetera.
Yeah. It's really interesting that I actually, just before I called you, was reading about the importance of having hard conversations with pregnant people before they, like in their early pregnancy, before they're experiencing later pregnancy, before they experience labor. So if they do have outcomes that they weren't wanting, they feel more prepared and more that there's like almost a sense of control because you knew, instead of a sense of shock that you then have to recover from. And there's so much research backing that and that importance of the information sharing. You can't have informed consent without information. And I find it really frustrating from my perspective when I'm trying to support people through their pregnancies, when their providers aren't giving them the information so that they don't have to worry about it, because if they don't know, then they can't worry, instead of empowering them with knowledge in case it does happen, because these things do happen to people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what really struck a chord for us is, going back to the earlier comment I made about feeling blindsided. Losing Maya after what seemed like a perfect IVF pregnancy was, the subchorionic hematoma was shocking. And to find out that this is really common in IVF pregnancy was frustrating. It's like, why wasn't this surface at the time, knowing it, so that I wouldn't freak out if I know that I have it, instead of having to come to knowing that, which was great. But prior to knowing that, having the self-blame, like, did I do something to cause this? It's not helpful. It is absolutely not helpful. And again, going back to the point about, pregnant people who have gone through pregnancy loss, the immediate thing that they do oftentimes is self-blame. And if we don't empower folks with information like these complications and the potential and what to watch out for, then it can definitely be so detrimental to mental health, which the heartache of losing a child add on to the self-blame I can't even tell you how much of that resonates with me and my grieving process. And I just hope to be able to, not so much, I know we can't prevent how people feel, but let them know they're not alone.
Yes, absolutely. So what are some questions you would encourage people who became pregnant through assisted fertility to ask their providers?
Yeah, that's great. So the Maya's Wings Foundation, we just developed on the IVF resources site questions where, depending on where folks are in their IVF journey or assisted reproductive technology journey, we have specific questions to ask. For example, if it's the first consult, you want to ask about logistics, timeline, the cost. Unfortunately, with infertility treatment is oftentimes not covered by your health insurance. And that's something that, we are working very closely with Resolve to help advocate for in states that really have very restrictive fertility coverage for people who do need them. And even for people who have the ability to afford it, it still gets really pricey. So those are things that you would want to ask during your first consult. And then another category that we have is like follow-up to labs or imaging. You want to ask, is there a specific diagnosis that you can see based on your findings, and what specific protocol do I fit in? What's the best route that I should go? Is IUI, intrauterine insemination, a good route for me? Or should I try just some medication and go the natural route in that way? If that's an option for the couple or for the individual, or is going right to IVF is something that should be considered. Those are all questions to ask as a follow-up to the labs and consults. And then what I will say that once you have that plan in place and you are, for example, prescribed medications, really, I think what I would stress there is ask why this protocol? Why not another protocol? What in my history, in my lab works would have you draw that conclusion? And it's not to question the clinical expertise of the specialist, but it's just to help you understand why certain medication is critical, and what happened if something goes wrong. What I mean by that is if you missed a day or two of the medication. And I know that, certain pharmacists does a really good job at explaining, but that's not always the case. And it's better to get that information from the provider that's prescribing it to you and have a rationale on what your protocol looks like, what your timeline looks like, and what specifically you want in your pregnancy, right? So those are all things that I would recommend people to ask. And there's definitely a lot more content in ivfresources.org, where we really detailed out the specific questions that you may want to ask your providers. And I would say, as a patient that have gone through the IVF process, I wish I had this list of questions. So I don't feel like I'm just asking them as they come and not feel as prepared as I did. So if nothing else from these questions, it just reaffirms you that you're asking the right questions to your provider.
Awesome. Yes. Providing lists of questions for providers is really helpful for anyone, even not an assisted pregnancy. So that's fantastic. Wonderful, wonderful resource, which is also really great for doulas. You should be accessing these types of resources as well. If you're supporting somebody who has gone through assisted pregnancy, sending them to this resource to be able to ask those questions can be very empowering for them as well, and should be something that you have readily available to give out to your clients. Speaking of having resources for people, can you tell me about your infertility group with the National Infertility Support Group?
Yeah, so the My's Wings have partnered up with Resolve, the National Infertility Association, where we hold a peer-led support group on a monthly basis. And that support group really is around infertility and or pregnancy loss. And why I say and or pregnancy loss is, from my own experience, after losing Maya, I've looked into resources for support groups, and it's either infertility or pregnancy loss. And we know that infertility, unfortunately, is accompanied with the heartache of pregnancy loss as well. So there isn't, at least from my personal experience, I've not found a group that supports both. And that's what I want to offer for people, to have that ability and hold that space for both. Whether it's, they don't have to have both, but if they do, I want to make them feel safe that this environment, you can have both and you can talk about both. And it's completely normal to have grief associated with infertility and or pregnancy loss. They could be very separate, very different grief. And I hope to continue supporting people in that way, to allow them the ability to talk about both. And it's for everyone. It doesn't matter if, you're an individual, you're a couple. It's completely inclusive.
Wonderful. And people can find access to that on your website?
Yeah, they can find access on our website, on the Resolve's website. It's the last Thursday of each month from 6 to 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And I do have to say that we have a couple of out-of-state folks in the East Coast joining. And so far, I haven't heard that time is conflicting, but, as we get more, and I want to keep it virtual so that people have the ability to join from wherever they are. And once we get a big group going, I think, if there's a need to reevaluate time, I'm happy to do that.
Okay, fantastic. Well, if you do that, then we can go back and add some more times in the description on here, which I have the email that you sent me with the current times that I will be able to post. Okay. What are some resources that you would like for people watching this podcast to have access to?
Yeah, I think For us, the Maya's Wings Foundation, definitely, because it not only has resources associated with the IVF journey because it links directly to ivfresources.org, but also it has information on grief, specifically sibling grief too. And as I mentioned earlier, our son was 2.5 when we lost Maya, and we decided, and this is our choice, not every person who's gone through this process would want to disclose this information to a young child, and I completely get that. But I also at the same time can't hide my grief from my 2.5-year-old son, who is very, in my opinion, very emotionally intelligent for his age. So I definitely was searching for sibling grief so that he can better understand why, I'm feeling that way. His mom, Bella, is also feeling that way. So we definitely have resources for that. And I want to put a plug in that in that whole entire journey of helping ourselves pull out of the sadness, the depression associated with losing Maya. And I would say, I don't want to say pulling myself out of the grief, because I don't think grief is linear. I think it comes in waves, and there are trigger moments for sure. In that process, Bella, my wife, wrote a book, and I'm Still a Big Brother is the book, and it's really to highlight for folks that are in a similar situation where, they're excited to have their expanding family. How do you make of the siblings that came before? Do you not tell them? Are they not still consider a sibling to someone else? And we have made the choice that we're going to let Jackson know about Maya, and we're going to let him know that he is still a big brother, even though his sister's not with us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. It's been such an honor to be able to speak with you and to be able to share this story with you and the resources. So thank you for coming on to do that with us today.
Thank you. I just got a little emotional there at the very end.
Absolutely. It's a very authentic and emotional topic. And thank you for being vulnerable with us and sharing your story with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kristen, appreciate you so much for allowing us to share the resources, because I can't tell you how important it is for folks to know that this resource exists and it's free. And I can't tell you that as I was doing my own research, I've come across so many resources that are not free, and also a lot of conflicting information that's out there. I want to highlight that, for IVF resources, when we put content out there, it's vetted through experts. We have worked with various different clinicians throughout the nation just to make sure that we can standardize the process, and also to make sure that we're putting out information that is accurate, and it isn't just going to Dr. Google to figure out, is this right or not, without having experts to vet it through and really give folks a peace of mind as they're reading through the content. So thank you again for allowing us to share that information here with people today.
Well, thank you for joining us. And thank you everybody who is watching this online. Feel free to share it with anyone that you know who is going through IVF or birth workers. This is very important information for you to have, and use the resources that we put down in the comments. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
The following media content is intended to only be an educational reference guide and should not be taken as a substitute for medical advice. While KC Women's Ministry adheres to strict self-set guidelines, any advice, instructions, or information found within this media is not intended to be a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. KCWM makes every effort to broadcast correct information. We simply present the views based on evidence-based information. We welcome any comments, suggestions, or correction of errors. We are not sponsored by drug or device companies. By listening or viewing this podcast, you agree not to use this podcast as medical advice to treat any medical condition in either yourself or others, including but not limited to patients that you are treating. Consult your own physician for any medical issues that you may be having. This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to the podcast. Under no circumstances shall KC Women's Ministry, any guests or contributors to the podcast, or any employees, associates, or affiliates of KC Women's Ministry be responsible for damages arising from the use of the podcast. Viewer discretion is advised.